Hi, I'm Johnny Burtka, the president of ISI. We filmed this episode of Project Cosmos prior to the horrific and tragic assassination of my friend Charlie Kirk on September 10th. This episode dives into the foundations of what it means to be a great and good man in 21st century America, qualities that Charlie embodied in his life and that we have a duty to carry on in honor of his legacy. When I met Charlie 10 years ago, few remember that he was criticized not only by those on the left, but also by those on the right, who saw him as a young, ambitious upstart with a bold vision that threatened the status quo. He built a successful movement. He proved them wrong by learning, by diving into great ideas, by studying the great books and the wisdom of the Western and American tradition, by getting married, by raising a family, and by deepening his faith. Those are the topics that we discuss on the show today. And as we all mourn Charlie's loss, I think our conversation will help you to understand the things that motivated Charlie and inspire you to be better men in your own communities. I hope you enjoy the episode. Well, to kick things off, James, I want to ask you a question that I think has been on the mind of a lot of young men in particular on the New Right today, which is it possible to be a great man while also being a good father or a good husband? Or is it just inevitable that the children of great men turn out to be terrible?
Well, that's a great question. But even to frame it oppositionally in that way, I think is immediately to beg the question against those of us who'd want to say to be a great man is first and foremost to be great in the discharging of one's obligations to those who are closest to us and to the most natural and intimate and vital relationships that any man can have, namely to be a husband and to be a father. This is how Aristotle opens his politics. He doesn't start with grand theories of political philosophy. He says, we are paired beings. Human beings are paired, and they rely upon each other. And those bonds are the foundational primary bonds. And for the enabling of new life, and then so on, the concentric circles of oikos, koma, the village, and finally the polis, which is sort of the outermost structure, which then provides downstream the conditions for the great man as we might think of it, probably in the subtext of your question, the greatness of a Pericles, the greatness of a Themistocles. I mean, this debate is often, I'm sure we'll start, I might as well just raise his name because he's going to come up soon anyway. Thomas Carlyle, who has the great, his theory that, I don't think he quite said this, but, history is sort of a series of biographies of great men. And that's often misunderstood to mean great man in the sense of a Napoleon, though he did include that, or a Churchill, somebody massively consequential in some way on human history. It's actually not what he says in his famous, is it on hero worship and the heroic in history, 1841-ish. He says that actually the great men are people, he has a phrase, they sort of dwell deep in the world's workings, sort of phrase like that. It's almost a great man is somebody who is spiritually attuned. I think here actually, I know we've got a Gallo file here and Nathan. I often think of de Gaulle. I think he actually might have been a piece Nathan wrote about de Gaulle. Somebody wrote about de Gaulle. I've been thinking a lot about de Gaulle.
With his disabled daughter.
And his disabled daughter. And that is just a wonderful anecdote, just a wonderful little glimpse into his life of this quite austere, frankly, typically obnoxious Frenchman, but a sense of pride of his own greatness and self-esteem, and he somehow felt that he was carrying France, that he was France. In many ways, he was from May 1940 to August 1944. But he was also this extraordinary father to a deeply disabled daughter, humble Catholic, and somebody. So that's when I think of a great man. I think we shouldn't try and sort of frame it oppositionally and say, is this something for the new men on the new right? Is this kind of insuperable tension comparable to the one that the sort of modern women have to wrestle with between career and motherhood? Do we have to bring in also an opposition between being great for society and great fathers and great husbands? We want to think of a scheme conceptual scheme that integrates all of those together.
And real quick before Nathan jumps in, there is this very short book de Gaulle wrote called The Edge of the Sword, which a friend of ISI, Dan Mahoney, turned me on to. And this is basically his own Mirrors for Princes, but he wrote it before he had accomplished really anything. It was sort of after World War I. He was ashamed that he was, captured. He sat down and kind of sketched this. Really, it's sort of like a vision of Aristotle's magnanimous man. And then he devoted his life to becoming the man that he sketched out. And,
yes. Yes, I mean, another person I think we'll probably start talking about a lot is Plutarch and the whole tradition of trying to become a more virtuous, a greater person by attending to the lives of others, to the lives of great men, or maybe to the lives of less than great men. And I think, sort of Plutarch's sort of themes are, great men, it's not something you're just born with, it's something that's normally hammered out in you through a difficult early upbringing very often, through often a sense of crisis, and a kind of moral clarity and a moral certainty. I think de Gaulle had all of those. In the book you referred to, he's horrified at France's inability to see what's coming in the 30s, inability to, build up and properly, protect itself, the sort of the munitions industry and so on and so forth. The great crisis, which is the making of the great man. May 1940, the refusal to surrender, even the refusal to even pretend to get along with Churchill and the British government when we were hosting him in London. He was extremely difficult to get on with, but there was that forged him. There was a kind of crucible there, and I think there was a moral clarity too, and a sense of purpose. And so that whole tradition of the mirror of princes. I mean, everyone thinks of Machiavelli as a prince, but it goes right back to Xenophon's Cyropaedia. There's this weird but wonderful book I was just reading a few months ago, by a Greek, an Athenian, about an emperor, for a start. He's a radical, he's a democrat. He's writing and praising a Persian emperor, the old enemy, saying how wonderful he is. He's this model king, and what's he up to? And it's sort of great tradition of exemplarism, not just for statesmen and leaders, but for ordinary people. It surprises us today, but Plutarch's lives were, that was moral education in the classical world.
So I like that a lot, and I want to think that's true, and I think that probably is true. And it reminds me of a slightly less noble piece of literature, The Godfather, right? When Vito Corleone is upbraiding Johnny Fontaine, and he asks him, "Do you spend time with your family?" And he says, "Sure, I do." "Good. Because a man who doesn't spend time with his family can never be a real man." And I think that's intuitively true, but I think where it gets really difficult to be true is in the lived reality of your day-to-day life when you have children, as I think a lot of us do, or if you're someone who is not yet married but wants to have children, you want to be an excellent husband, an excellent father. You'll have 24 hours in a day. Life is trade-offs, and my sense of that is, yes, you have to be great at home. You have obligations to the world. Sometimes being great at home requires you to rise to these moments. And so I just been curious as people's thoughts on that, because the sad reality is a lot of truly great men, at least in the modern era, their children do not like them. Presidents. There are exceptions, right? Donald Trump's children seem to really like him. Teddy Roosevelt's children loved him. President Reagan's children were known to not care for him, or to have a contentious relationship with him. And a lot of the presidents are estranged from their children. Lincoln's children really seemed to like him and love him. And Robert Lincoln didn't follow in his father's footsteps, but devoted his life to the building up of the country that his dad sacrificed himself for. So I'm just curious.
Richard Nixon's children liked him quite a bit.
His daughter told him not to resign.
Yeah.
She said, "Don't do it, Dad. Stay."
Should have took his advice.
Yeah. Exactly.
Should have took her advice. Yeah.
Indeed.
We hope you're enjoying Project Cosmos, conversations on the future of civilization. If you'd like more content like this, please like and subscribe, or sign up for our newsletter, the Intercollegiate Review, in the comments section.
Well, one of the things perhaps that just was reflected upon both of it, I think I agree with everything you said. But part of the challenge, perhaps it's an effect of living in mass society, is not just the mechanization of everything, but the pace, the acceleration of pace. The analogies that Churchill used are about war, but we can see that there's demands placed upon young people in the sense that young men especially, you have to do everything at once. And what I find so helpful about studying de Gaulle is it's kind of the anti-Alexander in the sense. There's that image that Caesar, I think Suetonius raises about Caesar, that he had turned 33 the age that Alexander dies, and he thought, what have I accomplished at this age? And it's very easy for young men now to fall into the same thing because you can have friends who become successful overnight in venture capital or in the world of mass media. Influencers and such, and it's very difficult if you're not in that to wonder if you're missing out or you're doing something wrong, or to start chasing honor or chasing respectability. One's better than the other. To chasing respectability is a great curse. But with de Gaulle, you see someone who spent his life thinking first before acting, and it seems to have been that. By the 1930s, when he was writing Edge of the Sword and thinking about French rearmament and the other book, Towards a Professional Army, I can't remember now the English, L'armée du métier, changing the French military to have more mobile force. That really he wanted to serve his country and wanted to be a minister of defense. That's kind of what he imagined himself to be, maybe a kind of Cardinal Richelieu or Mazarin to some president, but not actually someone who was going to take the Alexandrian route. And yet, because of his training, because of his formation, because he'd spent time to think well, to raise a family well, these aspects of his life that are veiled, it's so hard to find good photos of that, just because that was very much an intimacy that when Providence asks something of him, he was ready to respond. He had formed himself. So you need a sense, I think, of a lot of what I think might be missing in these tensions or these dilemmas that are posed is really a lack of spiritual awareness to be ready to respond to what is asked of you at a time. A need to encourage people to think about providence, and to recognize you can't create everything or make everything happen at once. And so many of our false moral dilemmas, I think, it's a kind of classic philosophy experiment, or these thought experiments that are posed. So many of them are designed so that we don't think about providence. These false problems that you know very well, these trolley problems that the students debate over, and such. They're designed to reduce options such that it seems like there are only two choices, when in fact, in reality, there's so much more. And a true response to many of these, we do have these moral dilemmas, I think, is in fact to step back and ask, well, what else? Who are the other actors that could do something here?
That's true, and I agree with all you've said, but there also is a need for a certain amount of spontaneity as well. And one of the difficulties that we have in society today is that young people are taught to think ideologically. They're taught to think in terms of rigorous procedures, as opposed to actual substantial scholarship, but simply having the right footnotes, going to the right colleges for that matter. All of that is extremely formalized, and it creates a certain kind of mentality among young people, which is often makes them prisoners of intellectual cages they don't even know they occupy. One of the great things about Donald Trump is that he is breaking out of those cages. He is a very spontaneous person. And as a result, he actually forces others, if they respond well to him, to realize, you don't have to take for granted all of these things, all of these liberal platitudes that have been drilled into your head from, kindergarten on through postgraduate education, that in fact you can recognize providence in the moment and respond more immediately. Now, having said that, I wanted to refer to something that Bill had mentioned. I mean, we certainly do see this tendency in America today where great men often have very strained relationships with their children, with their sons and daughters. Ronald Reagan, for example, famously had a very difficult relationship with his biological children. I wanted to bring up a classical example which shows that we need to think not only about the relationship of fathers and mothers to sons and daughters, but also the family in a larger sort of trans-temporal sense as well. Polybius, for example, is the great example here of a historian who's writing about the success of Rome. Why was Rome able to conquer the Mediterranean? Why was it the dominant power of its age? And one of the great images in Polybius's history is when he points to the death masks that line the Roman atrium. These are all the young Roman's ancestors going back generations. So even if that young Roman has difficulties with his own father, he's looking at all of these great men of his family, who was the consul, 50 or 100 years ago, and he is feeling the weight of expectations, the weight of accumulated majesty, basically, from all of these ancestors. And he feels a need to live up to them. And to refer to Machiavelli, who was brought up just a moment ago as well, Machiavelli, of course, warns about relying too much on fortuna, too much on what you've inherited, and not enough on your own virtue. One of the great things about this Roman tradition, and I think, you see recapitulations of this in Churchill, in so much of
Churchill's love for the Duke of Marlborough.
Exactly.
He devotes much time to the
There's this
book on
sense
that.
of the family as a great towering achievement over generations, but where I think Machiavelli comes into play here is that this is not simply something you take for granted and say, well, because I am a Churchill, because I am, descended from Marlborough, I am therefore entitled to what I have. Rather, it's the opposite. You feel, how can I possibly live up to the weight of these generations that came before me? And that actually forces you to become greater, because you have to fight against this fear of being subsumed by the greatness of your own ancestors.
If I have noblesse, I am obligé to perform and act and live out my life in a particular way.
It's the problem of not having a society or a society has lost sense of the intelligibility of the hereditary principle, as we lose exactly this.
Yeah, so I mean, in our present context, not for everyone, but for most people, they might revere, their parents, their grandparents, but often it's not necessarily a lengthy there's not a pedigree that they can kind of embrace in the same way as with the death mask. I'm curious, Alex, because I know you do a lot of, obviously your background is in classics, but coaching for a lot of CEOs, right? Especially in the tech world. And, I'm wondering, listening to some tech-related podcasts, there's a sense in which they unabashedly embrace and emulate Napoleon or Alexander or Caesar. It's just like they don't even think about any moral dilemma. It's just like all in imitation. I want to be great with my company. I want to build an empire, right? But if we think about the political realm, and I even noticed this kind of when I put together a collection of kind of great texts from the Mirrors for Princes tradition, people, especially scholars, get wary if you're telling young kids to read or Churchill had the bust of Napoleon on his desk. Napoleon imitated Caesar, Alexander Cyrus, and it was just like, this is what I'm going to become, a great man. I'm going to do it by imitation. In the tech world, like, they embrace that and they sign up for your coaching, right? I mean, in the political world, I don't know. So maybe you can unpack what is that? Why do the tech guys embrace it, and in politics we think, oh my gosh, that's terrifying.
Yeah, well, I think that they're a little less constrained by. Tend to be higher in disagreeability and not necessarily working through the proper channels that you're supposed to. But I think one thing that you can bring before somebody like that is to return to something that James was saying, that the Plutarchian mold isn't just about the public man. It's, as he says in his biography of Alexander himself, sometimes a chance phrase said in jest might reveal more of the character than 1,000 cities conquered. And so that can be the private life of these men as well. And so there's a number of examples of this in Plutarch's lives, but when he does the biography of the great Spartan king Agesilaus, there's a moment where Agesilaus is, of course, he's himself a good example of kind of waiting your turn, because he doesn't become the king of Sparta until he's 43 or 45, and it's in very dubious circumstances. He didn't think it was going to happen to him probably for most of his life, but then there it was. But somebody approaches Agesilaus at some point when he is king, and some Spartan officials coming out to give him a message, and he's there on his farm, and he's essentially playing horsey with his son. He bestrode a stick, as Plutarch says, and the Spartan official was a bit sort of shocked to see the king himself bestriding a stick, playing horsey with his son, and his shock that Agesilaus addresses. He responds, "Say nothing until you have sons of your own," as though there was something kind of to apologize for. Because there is this sense of a king has to maintain a certain decorum, and when you approach a king at home, you expect to find him working on the affairs of the state. But Agesilaus is kind of pointing out the fact that no, I have other duties, and part of your duty as a father is to maybe be silly with your kids sometimes. But I think it points to this. It's a constant tension that is there in antiquity, and so bringing the emulation of the great deeds in war and politics or business to a relationship with a person like that, you can kind of start to peel back the layers and say, hey, there's other aspects of greatness that your character has to be kind of consistent throughout if you really want to build a legacy. Alexander, a great example of a sort of failed legacy, perhaps despite himself. So there's a lot of considerations.
So I want to go from there to something you said, speaking to the young men who maybe feel like they're being left behind, like they're missing out on it. It's not, how can I do it? I'm wasting my time. Because I think that's familiar to any young man who has ambition, maybe a lowercase a, you want to make your mark on the world. Young boys want to do that. Young men want to do that. And I think about the most perfect man, right? Jesus, 30 years in complete obscurity in Nazareth, before his time comes and he goes out and does these amazing things. And that's a little bit, you see that played out in different other historical contexts. But Konrad Adenauer, who rebuilt Germany after World War II, was in his 70s or 80s when he became chancellor. And his whole life he had lived, trying to be someone in German politics, and was imprisoned by the Nazis and almost assassinated several times. And such that after the war, he's the only person the West trusts. And he outlived JFK. I mean, he was chancellor until I think 1965. And he saw West Germany become, he wanted to rearm, he wanted to get the foreign powers out, and he wanted to reinstill a sense of pride in being German, which in 1945 was like utterly impossible. And 20 years later, he'd done it in the Western part of his country. So I think to everything there is a season. Be faithful in small matters. What is your near-term responsibility? Your wife, your children, your parents. And as you said, be excellent habitually. Yeah. And then when
and spiritually, there's a good insight there about meditating on the hidden life of Jesus.
That's right.
And thinking about how he would have done and performed some of these ordinary tasks. That said, though, maybe I would put a danger out that I think is very easy for us to slip into when we're having these discussions, where we start talking about different forms of greatness and drawing attention to all these other ones. And one is great who does this thing as well. It's this glorification of the quotidian that I think we saw a bit after the Second World War. A figure like Albert Camus, I think, exemplifies some of the dangers in this approach, where the task is to develop a kind of existentialism and an embrace of accepting no meaning as a higher. So you're kind of there. The danger is and perhaps this is what many of us have revolted to in our own short lives, a sense that we encountered a generation that just wanted us to do that, and was telling us that you can be great by doing this and you can be great by doing that, and everyone is special. And as the great wisdom of the film Incredibles taught us, which is the same as saying no one. Yeah, so
it nicely reinforces your earlier point, Nathan, about the importance of providence as this sort of midway point between the raw anarchic freedom of the existentialist hero in Camus and such, who is too free to be good. Because to be good is to acknowledge some objective standard that will be a constraint, or some bourgeois standard that will be a constraint on my right to exercise my freedom and to author my life as I see fit. And authenticity is the only is the most important value and therefore the only value for the existentialist hero. And on the other hand, sort of crude, reductive, scientistic models are sort of just, well, we're just animals that have got lucky in the evolutionary game. There is no real freedom. We are just, we're doomed either to mediocrity or to whatever the outcome of whatever adaptive fitness has in store for us. And so, providence, and it sounds like it's quite a clunky, theologically freighted word, and maybe there are other ways we could frame it. Maybe there are ways that would be acceptable to a more secular disposition to understand it. But I think there is something very important about that sense that there are trajectories to history, but that doesn't abolish our freedom, and particularly the only freedom worth having, that is to say the freedom not to do whatever we want, but the freedom to do what we ought to do.
James, could you distinguish, I think we have a clear sense of what providence is. How does that compare or contrast with like Machiavelli's understanding of fortune?
Well, I suppose, I probably defer to Dan on that. I think what I'd say is, fortuna, as Machiavelli sees it, and virtue as well, is quite a self-conscious moment in the Rinascimento, of recovering this sort of kind of defiantly and provocatively pagan way of thinking about fate. Now, that's not quite the same as determinism, but it's not that it abolishes freedom either, but it's more, I suppose, it's more chaotic. The Stoics talk a lot about fortuna. I suppose that's the tradition, philosophical and ethical tradition, that it's most tightly associated with. The Stoicism, you walk through airports today, it's incredibly popular. Pop Stoicism, it's kind of everywhere. And I've never really rated it myself as a philosophy. I always find it baffling. How can you be both a materialist and committed to this animating principle of ratio and logos in the world that is about to, there's always going to burn up in an ekpyrosis every sort of 500 years, whatever it is. But there is an appetite there, which I think Alex's work is tapping into much more effectively than the Stoic bros, I think, because Stoicism is not a moral tradition that elevates exemplars. It's just, we're basically just atoms. Fortuna, the fatum, is just dragging us all along, and there's not much point in trying to emulate somebody because, we're just being dragged behind the car.
You do have Cato the Younger, and for that matter, any number of Stoic sages who are precisely that you do, in fact, learn something as a Stoic or as someone who is starting down that path, that you have this exemplar who's either a teacher or a public figure who has lived a rather heroic life in defiance of his times, that you have to then understand how the virtues informed them, made them what they were, and then how you can have that as well.
But it's interesting, if you think of Seneca, he's not writing about people he admires. He's writing about abstract concepts. De Clementia, right? And how De Clementia itself is a famous example in the Mirror of Princes tradition. It's a very nervously written piece about mercy for Nero, because he's worried that he's not going to show him very much. But maybe I'm overplaying that. But I've always felt with the Stoics and the Epicureans, those sort of moral traditions, the eggheads, the abstract, the ones who always are self-consciously moral philosophers, are the ones who are least able to actually enact moral change. And actually it's a humbler thinker like Plutarch. If as you almost always do, read the lives with the Moralia, right, that slightly chaotic collection of 70 essays where he talks about virtue. Can virtue be taught? The great question of Plato's Meno. He says, yes, it can, but it takes effort, and you've got to listen to Alex's podcast.
but Cato himself is kind of an example of being a blocker for a high agency man in Caesar. It does kind of get to the problem of Stoicism. And other than that, Marcus Aurelius is a great emperor, certainly, but, he would never have risen to power on the virtues that he preaches if he had not been picked for that office. There's a kind of like surrender to fate. I find it kind of striking how rare the examples of these like Stoics in public life are, even though Stoicism preaches that the wise man will enter politics when necessary. And yet, if you look at the late Republic of Rome, most of the high agency actors are Epicureans, paradoxically, because they're supposed to, escape notice with your life. But you got Caesar, arguably, I think he's an Epicurean sympathist. You've got, Cassius, the guy who assassinates him, and many others that are just right in the mix there. There's something strange to me about that.
I think the example of Marcus Aurelius is an interesting one. And I think it reinforces my suspicion. I mean, I often ask students, I play this game, if you were to read the Meditations, so they're in Greek for a start, it's not even in Latin. If you read them cover to cover, not knowing who wrote them, and you were to guess at the end, what kind of person wrote this, no one would say the most powerful man in human history, on campaign in Dalmatia, in his imperial HQ. There's a total cleavage, total divorce between Marcus Aurelius' reflections on the good life, on cultivating inner stillness, and his actual life, the actual concrete practicalities and particularities of it. Actually, it's just astonishing. I don't mean that as a criticism necessarily. I'm just saying that I think that Stoic skepticism or indifference to exemplarism is a kind of early example of the sort of ethical theorizing that I think has bedeviled much Anglophone moral philosophy since the Second World War, which is the theories, it's Kantianism or it's utilitarianism or whatever.
The reason I emphasize the other side of this, though, is because so much of the development both of American Republican thought and also the preceding British Whig thought is precisely looking to figures like Marcus Aurelius and to Cato the Younger. They are seen as exemplars. So I take your point very much that...
Oh, sure, a Stoic can be an exemplar, but...
The reduction to theory is a danger. But even within Stoicism, even within these ancient philosophies, which do in fact have a strongly impersonal quality, there is also, there are these exemplars which our own history, both as Americans and as English, have been taken out and have been, in fact, things that have informed our own statesmen, our own greatest individuals, whether they're prime ministers or founding fathers of the United States, or for that matter, great authors as well.
But to go back to this theme that you raised on Providence, I don't know if you were going to talk about that. This is another instance of this kind of over-rationalizing potentially where, okay, are we determined because we're in a materialist cosmos? The Epicureans and the Stoics seem to kind of think that, or do we have free will? But I mean, you don't need the over philosophizing of the Stoics to kind of get to that tension, at least, because it's already there in Homer. It's there in the heroic journey, the epic quest. But I think that if you look at the way that it works for the heroes in Homer, Sarpedon and Glaucus, these two Trojan warriors on the battlefield, let us go and fight whether we are to give the glory to another or they to us. Whether we're going to be kill or be killed, it's fated. Yes. But that realization is supposed to drive you all the more courageously into battle, into an extreme risk-taking sort of...
Churchill kind of had that too when he was chancing fate on the front lines.
You see that even in like the modern American military from people on the front lines, trigger pullers. I've heard U.S. Marines talk about that. Just kind of a disregard for, not disregard, but a disdain almost for who's going to get credit for it, because we know that we will have done the hard task. And it's enough, it is satisfying enough. I can satisfy myself that I have done this very difficult, very dangerous thing with my brothers who were here with me doing that. So there's a lot to unpack.
That tension that you draw attention to, Alex, and there's that, what is it? I think it's the fifth line of the Iliad, Dios deteleator bule, and the will of Zeus is accomplished. There's this idea that the will of Zeus is determining and shaping the whole narrative arc of the Iliad, and yet, Achilles and Odysseus and Nestor and Agamemnon, they are the most agential figures in Western literature. Yeah. And you think of those diaries from First World War soldiers, Danny was shot this morning, that bullet had his name on it. I'm off to Sunday church. I'm going to church. there's the fates and there's God, and it's somehow not a kind of contradiction for the human mind. It's just the way the world goes, and we attune ourselves to different ways to how we understand historical development.
Yeah. And I think that's got to be universal human nature too. You saw Union soldiers outside Cold Harbor, Petersburg, writing their names and their home addresses and pinning them to the back of their uniforms, before an assault, on the assumption that they're going to be killed, and they want the survivors to know where to send their bodies back. So that's something about human nature, but they're still there and they're still doing it, and they're afraid, but they don't want to let other people down. So I guess my question is, we've been talking about in a very kind of atomistic, individual sense. Individual people want to be great. What is the role of being around other people who also want to be great? And the two of you talked about this at your panel the other day, and I thought that was actually the most interesting part. You talked about honor gangs, mini honor cultures within larger organizations of people who challenge each other to be great. And I don't know if it's always competitive. I'm sure it oftentimes is, but I think my guess, and I would love to hear your thoughts, is that the best mini honor gangs are ones that challenge you in a benevolent way to be better.
Just to fill in a bit of context for the viewer and the listener there, the seminar, the discussion that Bill was referring to was a wonderful series of four reflections for the National Conservatism Conference in Washington, D.C. in September 25, and Alex began and spoke brilliantly about honor gangs, Plutarch, and so on. There were 2 or 3 others, and it was the atmosphere in that room was electric. I was surprised, pleasantly surprised that this was a very big collection of the right, of the young right, of young men and women who were hungry to hear about and understand what it is to lead a heroic life. And I think the 4 speakers did a superb job, starting with Alex. So anyway, just to tee you up, Alex.
Well, I spoke about greatness of soul in that talk, and zeal, this, the pain you feel when you see somebody else achieving something that you would like to achieve, that makes you want to achieve that. And I think that in another context, I've called them zeal bands. You could call them honor gangs or zeal bands. That this effect of, when you get people together who all share that kind of high thumos attitude toward life, there's a multiplier effect, partly because you're seeing everybody else and seeing the stand and seeing something that you admire in them, and that causes you to raise something within yourself as well. And we can talk about honor in a moment, but I do think that we have to keep in mind when we're studying the great men that they often have these bands around them that you don't see preserved so well, especially in the ancient sources.
I mean, you think of the city of Thebes as the famous Band of 300, the sacred band.
Yeah.
Very extraordinary phenomenon. Even Alcibiades and his mates, causing havoc with the Herms. And what were they called? Hetyroi or something? They were... Yeah, they were.
Hetyroi.
Hetyroi, that's right. And
and before the sacred band, the solstice revolution, when these 7 or 11, depending on which source you look at, Thebans gather together to talk about philosophy in someone's house in Athens because they're exiles, and the Spartans have kind of locked down their city with a
low and
garrison.
untrustworthy, the Thebans.
Yeah.
But Socrates is disrupting all of that, though. So, I mean, do we think that Socrates is perhaps doing the wrong thing by breaking up these bonds of friendship among young men who actually, from a Socratic point of view, have the wrong priorities and have the wrong outlook on life? They are an aristocratic gang of friends who want to be great. Alcibiades, of course, being the prime example here of a man whose ambition far exceeds his virtue. His virtue in goodness, that is. I mean, he certainly is a very skilled man. Whereas Socrates is presenting something that... Now, on the other hand, Socrates clearly does also create these bonds of friendship. Mm-hmm. It's very interesting, though, that so many of Socrates' closest friends and closest philosophical companions don't wind up necessarily following a unified path. I mean, in a way, the successors to Socrates are as much divided and diverse as the successors of Alexander are. in military and political terms.
Indeed. Yeah, well, actually, I think it's a good provocation to consider as to whether we tend to, in our intellectual circles, in our particular, say, post-Straussian intellectual culture, which has shaped a lot of us. And
what do you mean by a post-Straussian intellectual culture?
So the notion that we look to antiquity as for Socrates as our guiding figure is itself a contestable question, an interesting one. Nietzsche does, but he's ambivalent about it. As to there are good aspects of Socrates, but he's also critical of it. Heidegger does not think that Socrates is the figure we should refer to. This is the criticism that Hannah Arendt and Leo Strauss make of him, and so the effort becomes to recover him as the philosopher. But I do wonder sometimes whether we should pull away from that, whether that perhaps turns into a fetishization of philosophy as an individual practice that is separated and cut off from everyone else. To use an example, which is, of course, an issue right now in British politics, right? Does this change our attitude towards death? Should Socrates have, in fact, left? Should we give more scrutiny to these questions, particularly in a moment whereby we do have people who are so keen to seduce us towards an idea that assisted dying is somehow the noble thing to do? Now, I don't think that quite matches up to what goes on in the circumstance for Socrates, obviously. It's the state that has ordered his execution, and he's forced to drink the hemlock by the action of the state. And yet, my point is simply that we might want to reflect a little bit on some of these dynamics. Does Socrates ever call someone his friend? There are a couple instances, I think, in Arastai, one of the shorter Platonic dialogues, where the theme of that dialogue, the lovers, suggests that. But it's a very, very ambiguous relationship.
The Lysis is all about friendship, isn't it? Just trying to pin it down and trying to. But you're right. He's much weaker on it than, say, Aristotle is in is it book 7, book 8 of Nicomachean Ethics, and you might think of Seneca as well as this other sort of paragon of secular pagan virtue. Slits his wrists in the bath and stoically accepts death in a way that perhaps we might not be always comfortable with.
Well, this is though what I was wondering a bit in our discussion about the Stoics, that there's philosophy, of course, and there's a school of philosophy, but there's also a sociology of philosophy. A great Straussian, you may have coined the phrase, a great Straussian observation. What kind of social practice you have, and then think, reflect on that. What are the tendencies you get pulled towards at a particular in a particular society? So maybe there's a high account of Stoicism, the ones that you're referring to, the genesis of modern republicanism, where you look towards these figures and emulate them. But there does seem to be a kind of Stoicism of decline, whereby figures who are politically powerless, who've lost the capacity to reflect well in the public sphere because they haven't been able to come into it, then turn towards Stoicism, and this becomes a way of exaggerating.
Strategy of withdrawal.
But who would be an example of that, though? It seems to me that
Stoics, for Seneca.
I don't know
Cicero,
about that.
Cicero, Plutarch, of course.
Seneca and Cicero are obviously at the very heart of so much of English Renaissance thought and inspiration. We wouldn't have Shakespeare without Seneca. So the idea that Seneca, because he dies a mortal death, is therefore simply a symbol of defeat or a symbol of concession, I think that's completely wrong. He, and just as Socrates is, and Cicero and Cato the Younger, all of these figures with their martyrdoms are in fact tremendously powerful and transformative for centuries afterwards, which can't be said of a great many people who may have been emperors of Rome, but in fact did not have lives that mattered beyond their own time.
I think this exchange between Nathan and Dan is fascinating, because I think it takes us to a deeper question, or an upstream question that we haven't put on the table yet. Namely, the problem with moral exemplarism and trying to model one's moral life on lives and particular characters in the past presupposes some kind of objective standard of what is admirable. And so Dan will be more drawn to the English Renaissance elevation of the Senecas and the Ciceros and the Socrates, whereas Nathan is nervous because of his maybe our shared prior commitments about theological commitments. And so are we...
Also, what our own times demand.
Yes.
What kind of exemplars do our own times need?
Yeah, but even there's sort of worry about contingency, maybe historicism, relativism. You could imagine a Kantian coming in and saying, no, absolutely not. We start from first principles. We've got to work out what duty is, what reason is, and only then do we have the benchmark to assess what kinds of lives we should be moved by and attempting to emulate.
There is this curious tendency for philosophies which may be abstract. So currently, with the Pompeian scrolls that are now being deciphered, we have now a much
by the
richer...
Doge boys.
Yes, we now have this much richer body of very technical Epicurean philosophy that's extremely...
Philodemus.
That's right. It's Philodemus. It's extremely dull, at least dull to a non-specialist. And it would not inspire anyone in centuries to come, even if it had survived. Whereas then you think of Lucretius. You think of these interesting figures, poets who are taking philosophy and are actually doing something perhaps unphilosophical with it, but they are able to transform souls that come generations, centuries, even millennia after them. They're inspired by the philosophy, but they're not keeping it at the level of abstract ideas. They're in fact turning it into something, it's almost like alchemy.
Dan, can you, thinking of the American founders kind of in our own political context, to what extent was it beginning with first principles versus the action, the drive for independence to be a kind of a self-governing people to kind of achieve the independent status in the world, and then the ideas buttress that in the process of the action?
Well, the ideas were reached through historical personages. So they were very much readers of Plutarch. When they thought about Epicureanism, they thought of Cato, they thought of Marcus Aurelius. They were not spending their time meditating on Plato and on more abstract ideas. Instead, their way of approaching the ideas was not to disregard the ideas, but it was to say, this is how the idea has been personified, this is how it has been embodied in history, both classically and also more recently in British history. So they were very much informed by that sort of, that human context of ideas, not simply the ideas as a more Kantian, abstracted and bloodless approach.
But I think this raises the question of that you're pointing at, Johnny, that it does kind of philosophy come first, and James is kind of pointing at this too, and then action follows, or does a kind of need for action arise, and then you find the philosophy that fits? And in a way, you could actually say this. Tell the life of Plato in these terms, because as he tells his autobiography in the 7th letter, he says, I wanted to go into politics like the rest of us. He's from a great family, would count Solon as an ancestor, and he was educated by Socrates, but you get the sense from a Xenophon or an Alcibiades that these kids aren't going to Socrates thinking, oh, we're going to be otherworldly sages. They're looking for the thing that's going to give them the honor, the edge to get ahead. And that's possibly why Plato was there in the first place. But then after Socrates died, he decided that something needed to change. And the way that he speaks about it, he says, I saw that, and this is in the 7th letter, I saw that it was not easy at all to figure out what was the best kind of state, nor, if you had been able to figure that out, to find the men who could put that theory into practice. And I think you can look at Plato's whole philosophical project, even the dialogues, which are, obviously brilliant philosophy and a writing, which is something that Socrates never did. So in a way, he's doing something very different from his teacher, as a way to kind of like gather the right people in the room ultimately. And famously, he goes and he has this long relationship with the court at Syracuse, and you can kind of see philosophy was the thing that enabled him to do that. The reputation he developed from his writings, the kind of people that he was able to get the interest of, the brother-in-law of the tyrant, Dion, who has got a great Plutarch biography where Plato's a character. There was a real political project there for Plato, not only political, but it the philosophy kind of enabled something that he saw a dire need for at the end of the Peloponnesian War. Athens and Sparta are, Athens is in ruins. Sparta's losing its credibility as a great kind of beacon of virtue, and like something new needs to arise. And that's kind of the problem I think his whole career might be solving.
And it's across time. So even if the politicians, the tyrant of Syracuse in your day, even if you don't have the right human materials at the moment to change a state for the better, by writing this down, you are able to communicate with a different group of people in the future. And in fact, maybe even your writings will create the very thing you're trying to look for.
That, in fact,
That
in fact is Thucydides' great project, isn't it? In the opening of his history of the Peloponnesian War, he says that I'm writing this history as a katema estor ae, a possession for all time. Even though it's actually, yes, it's a brilliant history, but a history about a very specific 27-year war. But he says, human nature is being what it is, doesn't change very much. This is going to actually give us a clue into the nature of relations between states, the nature of relations between human beings, the way in which fear and honor drives us towards noble ends and ignoble ones.
And Sir Philip Sidney, when he was talking about Xenophon Cyropaedia, right, it's because Cyrus was imagined well, right, it has the power to create many more Cyruses than if he just kind of wrote out the plain history of Cyrus. I'm thinking of our own kind of political context. Curious, if you think about, let's say, Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump, right, there's a sense in which... who are they, right? And Dan, you're the expert conservative historian, but there's a sense in which for Reagan, the ideas did kind of come first. ISI was founded in 1953, National Review in 1955. They weren't totally fleshed out. There was a lot of tensions and back and forth on the pages of these publications at these institutions. But then eventually, Barry Goldwater didn't work out too well, but eventually Reagan came along and kind of embodied the principles that had been hashed out before. Trump is sort of the opposite in this. Well, you had sort of a Pat Buchanan, kind of a voice crying in the wilderness on a lot of these issues several decades before. Politically, no one really took them up. And then when Donald Trump came down the escalator in 2015, all of a sudden these, the immigration issue, the foreign policy issue, the making things in America, the manufacturing issue, all of these things, right? He articulated them, the entire kind of intellectual infrastructure on the right, at first, mostly, not entirely, but mostly repudiated it. And then when he won, right, there were conferences organized. There were all sorts of meetings to figure out what is this? Let's create an intellectual infrastructure and credential people and whatever. We've discovered Pat Buchanan again. Oh, wow, we discover Alexander Hamilton.
Andrew Jackson,
right? And so there's a sense in which the intellectual ideas around the current Trump presidency came after the action of the individual man. And will probably live on because will become institutionalized.
But I do think there is a resemblance, actually, between Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump. And you're quite right that Ronald Reagan was much more of a reader. He was going to be very interested in Ludwig von Mises. President Trump, probably not so much. But what Ronald Reagan was doing with those ideas during his own lifetime was just as unpopular as what Donald Trump is doing with his set of ideas now. So back in Reagan's own time, to say that you were interested in Ludwig von Mises, it was literally very much like saying that you are a Make America Healthy Again sort of RFK person today. Ludwig von Mises and the Austrian School of Economics was considered to be as crackpot, as far out as any anti-vaccine ideology today. So Reagan was considered anti-intellectual during his own lifetime. And even though he was reading these books, they were not the books that were taken seriously by the Keynesian establishment within higher education. Now, Trump... I think both Reagan and Trump were men of the moment in a way. They recognized, but men of the moment who understood that the moment was wrong. They understood that what had become the conventional wisdom of their own time had not always been true. And that in fact, saying that we must have globalization, we must have free trade in the Trump era now, Trump said, well, you know what? I actually know that there was a time when we took building things in America seriously. And there was a time when we were worried about Japan stealing our lunch, and now China clearly is doing so. And that we were actually right back then when we had those concerns, and we have not been right in the last 20 to 25 years when we have been deferring to this idea of fate, right? This inevitability of globalization, this idea it is a world system. It is, it's almost the ekpyrosis. Now it's not the Stoic idea of the natural trajectory of the universe ending in a conclusion, but it's this warped, post-Hegelian Francis Fukuyama version of an end of history.
A warped theodicy, we might say.
Yes, exactly. To which we must, that's right, to which we must all defer. And Trump said, no, I as an individual can actually say no to that. America as a country can say no to that. And Reagan actually in his own time was also defying the tide of what was considered to be the inevitable, direction of history. Because back then, it's not quite, it's a little bit of an exaggeration to say that the Soviet Union by the mid 20th century was seen as the wave of the future. That's a bit, a little earlier it was, but certainly not by the 50s and 60s. Nevertheless, there was this idea that, something about the Soviet Union was correct and that the West would have to move somewhat in the direction of that form, not necessarily the totalitarianism, but certainly this idea of a comprehensive, state that would be able to run the economy very well. We'd have to do it in a Western way rather than a Soviet way, but this was seen to be the inevitable wave of history. And Reagan said, no, it's not. And in fact, there was a better way of doing things before, and there will be a better and different way after this as well, after me. And Trump, I think, is the same way. He says this idea of an inevitable, intellectually respectable direction of history that has been approved by all of the economics departments, by all of the international law scholars who say you can't do this, you can't do that, that the world must go in the direction of uniform liberal democracy. Trump is resisting that as well. So it's a case, and there, I think Thomas Carlyle is a touchstone worth pointing to here, not because everything that Carlyle said would be wise, but rather he understood this role of the individual in history, and that they are what you need to break out of a convention which in fact is mistaken for being a permanent philosophical truth, but really is nothing more than just a fad, a clique that has been adopted by the powers that be today. Sorry.
No, that was really got me thinking, because I think what you both said about the tension between thinking first or action, like which comes first, principles or action, and then talking about how Reagan can be right in his era and Trump can be right in his time, and recognizing that you live in a material world with different forces that you have to contend with. And I think if we bring that down to the level of the individual, for people who are listening right now, young men, young women, whatever their station in life, and if they feel stuck and they're not sure what do I need to do to move and change my circumstances, I think the current moment is one that favors action. And rather than sitting and thinking endlessly, obviously ISI is always is going to stand by, hey, get your first principles right, and I do too. And for the moment that we're in now, especially given the way the economy has gone the last several decades, the cost of living has gone up, housing is it's impossible to buy a house.
What has theory delivered? And we're going to end up being we're going to end up being in the situation of the establishment intellectuals, or the conventional economists warning us about the craziness of the tariff strategy, whenever it was back in March, of saying, well, all this works in practice, but does it work in theory?
That's right. And so what I would say is
that's the important thing.
That's right.
And it doesn't.
And for those people, if you are feeling stuck, just start doing something. And this is something that, to bring it back to the tech world, something that you see there, it's just start building something. Action brings its own action surfaces or reveals the principles that you need. And if you're not sure what to do, pick a direction and start building in it. And if it's the wrong direction, that will become pretty clear.
Real quick to just jump in. We had an earlier discussion of this show where Chris Rufo and Curtis Yarvin were debating. And this was one of Chris Rufo's point, which is, it's so important that you take action to fight these battles. You might think, oh, you're not overhauling the whole system, but it's in action that you actually learn, and then you innovate and your strategies change and you learn things about your political opponents. And so without that action,
right.
you're never going to grow.
And the biggest obstacle to that action is not your opponent. It is your own fear of failure, your internal fear of failure. And if you've ever had to write anything, a lot of people here have written books. I've written a book. It's the most paralyzing thing that you're going to put this out here. It's your mind on trial for the world. And the phrase is you have to kill the critic because you will never put any words down out there if you're too afraid of being wrong. And you have to be willing to be wrong and to get destroyed by it at this iteration and then come back next time and be 2% better.
Now, this is a question for Bill as a novelist and for Alex as someone who coaches the tech world. But is AI going to create a massive problem here? Because now people who, instead of taking the time, getting over their inhibitions, writing, applying their minds in a very challenging and difficult way, they'll simply turn to an AI and have it produce, easily the kind of text that they should actually be struggling to do themselves.
Well, I think that AI is it might get better and better, but I still don't believe that it's ever going to really match the persuasive powers of a human. It can kind of fake them, but the jury may be out. But at the very least, it's never going to be able to generate trust, and you're never going to want to be persuaded by a machine. You're never going to want to put your faith in them. Pistis, the Greek word for belief or for persuasion is very similar to the Greek word for trust, which is connected to loyalty. And
it's the same word.
Yeah, it's the same word, and so
propositional and personal trust.
Yeah, faith is action and things like that. But what I was thinking when Bill was talking is about the fact that the tech attitude, especially in kind of cutting edge, high end tech, very much connects with this pattern you see with Reagan and Trump in a smaller way, which is the quote that I mentioned in my speech from Nietzsche. If you want biographies, then not those that say blah blah blah, Mr. So and so in his time, but a man who stood against his time should be inscribed on their title page. And the whole attitude of disruption, which may get overplayed, but for you to really build a successful business on tech, you have to kind of change the situation, right? And I think that being in that world can kind of train you in that direction. And I think that this is something that we need to keep in mind as people interested in the humanities, that, the great man tradition is a very, liberal arts sort of conversation in a lot of ways, even though it's, Napoleon is inspiring the founders, that you have to think about these guys, Napoleon and Alexander Hamilton, who we mentioned earlier, were trained up in this classical great man education that I call the rhetorical model, the Renaissance model. But then they go in to make their careers as artillery officers, which is a highly technical field, and they learn to master the cutting edge technology, which gives them, they chose that and not the cavalry. I think that's important, the arrows and the swordsmanship and the cavalry training of the nobility of Greece and Rome or the earlier periods of our history are now in drone warfare. And I mean, you also have to combine that literary training and greatness and the kind of spiritual training that we're talking about. If you really want to achieve great things with the kind of technical that tends to advance history at a more accelerated pace.
I want to hear Bill's thoughts in response to Dan's question, but just quickly, because whilst we're on that, Alex's train of thought, I wonder if there's something about biographies, lives, in particular autobiographies, that are somehow uniquely resistant as a literary genre to the ravages of AI that Dan was describing. That is to say, like, you could imagine AI writing pretty much anything in terms of certainly non-fiction, maybe very intricately plotted novels, but the life of the inner life of a human being, the inner sense of consciousness, the complexity of all the great novelists are able to do, that Plutarch's able to do, all the great that Augustine can produce in his Confessions. Could AI ever produce Confessions? I think, well, maybe, but that would seem to be the ultimate, that would be the very, very end point. I think there's something, you could imagine AI rewriting Kant or AI redoing utilitarianism. It's hard to see how AI, but just simply because the exemplarist tradition that we've been discussing so far is just so rooted in the human, as so rooted in the particular and in history and the soil of history and the particular social conditions we find ourselves in.
I'm not sure if that's true. I think there's a scene in one of Georges Bernanos' first novels, the Catholic spiritual writer, where the priest is walking through from one village to another.
This is his Diary of a Country Priest.
This is Under the Son of Satan.
Okay.
And he meets the devil, and the devil recreates a perfect image of him. And the notion there is that the devil can understand us better than we can understand ourselves. If we see AI ultimately as a spiritual problem, I think it has this capacity.
I don't, but
but the risk is of course the copies.
Yes.
And what that can come about. And so what's at issue there is not so much the questions about does it have the informational capacity to replicate or give a close replication. It's rather the kinds of the ethical response we give to this, the concern about when we read, say, we're gripped by an account, what it does to us. And that I would submit is actually what is ineffable about biography, the sense of human action that comes out of it, and what's so important to
pure irreducible subjectivity. Yeah,
and not just the subjectivity,
irreducible to the computational.
Yeah, and not just the subjectivity of the biographed, but the biographer too. I think this is a really, like, I'm reading a Rebel Yell biography of Stonewall Jackson by S.C. Gwynn, and it's beautiful. And I think if you had a perfect AI do that and do a better job of it, the second I knew that it was a computer writing it, my emotional response, not just to Jackson, but to the book itself, would be completely canceled out.
But unfortunately,
it's a mimetic relationship, not just with the person, but with the
But what if it
author.
flattered you first? Because I mean, it's trained to flatter you and get you to
dressed like Scarlett Johansson.
Yeah. And you do see right now, and I agree with everything you've said. I don't think AI has the capacity to write. I don't think it can even write Kant, let alone biography or anything of real human depth. However, most readers are not serious readers, and they're impressed by surfaces. And that's where I fear that AI is going to have a disastrous effect, because it's going to, just as it will make writers lazier than they already are, and as an editor, I know that that's a huge problem. It's going to make readers less discriminating as well. They're not, and even when you say, well, if you know it's written by an AI, you'll be less likely to trust it. You won't feel the connection. Unfortunately, I see examples every day, both on social media and even among certain intellectuals I know who have been bitten by the AI bug, of exactly the opposite. You see people who say, Grok, tell me what to think about this subject. It blows my mind, but this is something that is a common occurrence on X, Elon Musk's social media. And then among intellectuals I know, there are some who are saying, show me how... Literally, I have a friend who is having an AI rewrite the idea of fusionism to solve all of our problems between traditionalists and libertarians. And he's a very smart individual, he's a philosopher, and I keep trying to tell him, I think you're missing something very important here. But he sees this as something that is magnifying and adding trustworthiness and depth to his work, whereas my perspective is this is less trustworthy and is more beside the point, and it's generating, because AI is so prolix, it just generates so much text. I mean, unfortunately, I won't go into the details here, but recently I received an email written by someone I know personally that was written by an AI. And my friend, had no idea just what a faux pas this was. But this email was just full of BS language that just kept going on and on. And I thought, what you're actually trying to tell me here is very brief. Like, if you just said it yourself, it would be much more to the point. So I worry that, it's someone asked me about, there's this interesting early 20th century writer named Albert J. Nock, and he tried to apply this idea called Gresham's Law, which is a idea in economics that says bad money drives out good. So people will hoard money that retains value like gold, and they will spend the fiat currency that's depreciating. And Nock said there was a cultural analog to that, where the sheer mass of bad writing and bad text, bad words will completely crowd out any kind of serious reader. This is why he really liked the state of Portugal, which at the time may have been run by Salazar, because he said, you know what, they have the best bookstores in the world precisely because they don't have mass literacy.
So, the question is, what does AI mean for novelists and creative writing? I don't know that AI can deliver a unique human insight yet. And that is something that is, I don't know if we know where that comes from. I mean, being Catholic would say it's divinely inspired by the Holy Spirit when you cooperate on some great creative act. If that's the case, then no, AI cannot deliver an insightful story. I think it can parrot stories very, very well and even get really, really good. But as you pointed out earlier, there's so much schlop out there that is of extremely low quality from which AI is drawing. And I think we saw that, the ChatGPT gets most of its content now from Reddit. So that is going to be a built-in Achilles heel, I think, for the LLMs as they, are deployed in a creative space.
Well, so much of great writing is, emotion moving reason, but it's, AI seems to kind of do the other way around. It's reason first, and is that ever going to move your emotions? Seems like a problem for the persuasiveness long term of AI storytelling.
Right. What AI cannot access is your lived experience, your memory. It can access your memories as they have been written down by you and posted somewhere online. But you have memories that you don't remember that you have. And I think when I've been writing, the best things I have written, it comes out and it reminds me, oh my God, that happened when I was 10 years old. And I remember how the creek smelled because of the silt and and then it triggers this whole new thing. But that's something that is deeply personal and private to me just because it was my experience. And unless I've written, now once you write it, maybe it's out there and some other LLM can then grab onto that. But
But this goes, I think, really to one of the great social, spiritual problems of our age is when people think that memory has to be put in a video or you tell an anecdote or that's the way you record is something that is accessible, is a form of information that is accessible to an LLM, as opposed to the private diary that you have that no one looks at and you only know the location of it or you only know the code. We really have a danger that we've hollowed out our sense of self in the digital age to put online. And once you do that, the sense of self, the sense of the public-private distinction, all that goes away.
It used to be when you saw a beautiful painting in a gallery, you couldn't take a photograph in the era before photography, so you had to write it down. You had to transpose what you'd seen and what it meant, both in terms of description, but also in terms of your own experience of it and your understanding of it. You would put that down in writing. And of course, that's a skill which, had been cultivated over the course of generations in the West. And now I think it's unthinkable. And I very much share the concern there that this idea that mechanical reproduction is going to substitute for the actual experience of smelling the silt in the creek. A lot of people just don't know and don't understand the difference between those things. And they have to be introduced to that difference. They need teachers and tutors who will do that for them. Otherwise, they'll be told that, the business world says an AI-written email is good enough. And since business is so much a part of, most people's lives, that might be their standard rather than the human
I wonder
standard.
if I could just take the conversation in a slightly different direction, or I just was struck as we've been talking about the rather sort of unreflective way in which we've just sort of assumed that these are questions to be directed towards the new right, particularly the new young right. And because I think we're probably right in our intuitions, in our assumptions. And so the question I want to put on the table is, what is so allergic for the left, for liberals, I think I can even say, modern liberals certainly, about these notions of heroism, of greatness, of achievement, of freedom for virtue, freedom to be released to do what we ought to do, what we could become. I don't think that's an unfair, and one's got to be careful if we're all sort of ideologically united in a similar sort of political perspective, but I don't think that's an unfair criticism of the left. I think When I think of my left-wing friends, I can feel them getting nervous at the.
I think they'd be terrified just to have, be sit if they were asked to even sit in the company.
And what is, and I have my views as to why that's the case, but I'm curious in hearing yours.
Well, our prompt for this was, I think, Mass Effects in Modern Life. And one of the things that strikes me reading that.
So Mass Effects in Modern Life, it's an essay by Churchill. Can you unpack that, the essence of it?
Yeah. So one of the things, if I recall, in the invitation of this gathering here is that essay. So Churchill writes this after the end of the First World War, and it's quite the late 1920s, I believe. Someone actually reflected on the 28th, so is that right? So around then. And one of the things he's reflecting on is first the experience of war, but second, the transformation of society. And the loss of the heroic that comes from taking what was once war, an individual activity, the knight charging into battle, the commander who's near, the Napoleon figure who knows how to position the guns and such, and you move it to a step back, far removed, from the actual front line, where the task is to bring everything together. It's one of the arresting images, which also, by the way, carries the scale of the danger involved here. Is he describes the gardener who goes into his garden to remove a wasp's nest, and the gardener has developed the right technique to eradicate the whole nest at once, and he does. And then Churchill has a very poignant observation, but a very concise one, that you would not call this act heroic. Now write that onto the scale of modern warfare, and you see, of course, the moral problem. But baked into that notion, if you think that there's something valuable here, it's that managerial society values coordination, values the capacity to organize activity on a large scale, and then heightens the worth of certain competencies that do that. The result then is that over time, what you're actually valuing is not human decision, not spontaneity, as you mentioned earlier, but rather a set of best practices in which the human task is to subordinate yourself to those best practices, the process.
Or rituals.
Or indeed. And so I think this is an important picture to grasp, because the immediate answer one could have to your question here is, well, they're just worried about Hitler. It's greatness, nobility. This is Hitler. This is fascism. But what is fascism a reaction to? It's a reaction to this kind of order. In fact, Churchill alludes to that in the essay when he, at the very end, he refers to the mountain peaks, and he's making a little pun there. Where he refers to one. This is after Mussolini, one of the mountains in California, Il Duce, the Capitan del Duce. So fascism is a reaction to this whole order. And since that time, I think there's two things have happened. One is that world has become more and more the dominant one, the one where you take best practices and you push the human aside. But secondly, the experience of the Second World War and the kind of ritual that we've developed as a society around it has been to maintain the moral imperative of depersonalizing power. Because if we personalize it, if we have people who are actually capable of making decisions rather than independent agencies, then we're back to authoritarianism. We're back to Hitler. So, on the one hand, you have to be able to counter this post-war ritual about what's going on here. Can the left do that? Very, very difficult. Second, perhaps the deeper problem is to counter this other managerial sense, and that's, I think, why they don't have the resources, and it falls to the right to do that, or for us to collapse into nihilism and civilizational suicide.
I think that's a brilliant answer, and it leads me on to the further question and thought of: is there anything we can do to escape mass technology, mass mechanization, mass managerialism? What do we do? Do we build catacombs? Do we how do we go about it? Do we forge honor gangs that are somehow uniquely resistant to HR harpies? How? What are the practical questions?
You have to commit personally and in your greater enterprise to being as authentically human and creative as you possibly can. And this is something you see a lot in the tech space and in the tech world. But it's and you have to have the power of belief, and that's something that our friends on the left are often very skeptical of. And if you have the power of belief, that means you have to have courage in your convictions. You can't be blind about it. You have to steel man arguments against yourself, find the strongest possible argument against what you think is true, meet it, and if you can defeat that, then you know you're right, so far as your powers of reason can tell, and then you are obligated to drive that forward and carry that forward in the world. So, if you're someone who's listening and you have some passion hobby that in no way makes money, do that hobby. Like as a child, I used to draw, and I was not bad, and I stopped doing it at a certain point, after around college or something, because it's a use of time. How am I going to make money from this? How's this going to advance my career? That was the exact wrong thing to do. And now I'm trying, not successfully, but trying, just to make time, just 10 minutes a week even.
The usefulness of uselessness.
Yes,
it's a wonderful
exactly.
essay. I can't remember who wrote it, but it's worth returning to.
And then counterintuitively, somehow, when I have done that, when I have made time to sit down and create, pen and ink sketch, the thoughts, the creativity, and that I needed to solve some other problem somewhere else came.
It's the virtue of eutropelia, the ability to play well when it's appropriate and in the appropriate way. It's a great book.
Maybe Father Shaw, The Unseriousness of Human Affairs, published by ISI, actually.
James Shaw, great figure. Died a few years ago. I think Nathan or was it John asked a mutual friend introduced us to introduce me to his thought. Yeah.
James's earlier point, however, gets me to think that there may be a distinction between the left and liberals and managerial, perhaps, types with the liberals, because the left does have a certain amount of personality and a certain cult of personality that comes through many times. So think about, and it's absolutely ghastly right now, but Luigi Mangione, this murderer, is something of a folk hero on the American left right now, and certainly Che Guevara historically has filled that role on the American left. So there is, and in terms of more humane leftists, I do find that you can talk to an old left labor historian, for example, and they will have the most vivid tales of labor organizers, real human beings who made a difference within their own community. And it's a world of difference from the managerial and the sort of cold-blooded liberal ideology, which does reduce everything to rituals and systems and best practices.
Yeah, it's funny, if you look at British Labour prime ministers, it's not an accident that Keir Starmer is named after Keir Hardie. But there's only one Margaret. There's only one Winston. There's a kind of iterative quality there. I don't know if we should read too much into that.
But look no further than Spartacus. The movie, and it's not just with Kirk Douglas, the classic Spartacus, which is a very communistic movie if you watch it now.
It's written by Dalton Trumbo, right? Yeah. One of the blacklisted authors.
Adapted from a novel that was also by a kind of communist in prison. But Spartacus was somebody that Karl Marx admired and wrote to a friend, we need to get everybody reading Spartacus now. And there is this tradition of heroism on the left, and I think this points to the fact that this managerial situation we find ourselves in, there's always going to be a kind of something that you could call a right and a left.
But it is very reductive. I mean, everyone is Spartacus.
Yeah, right. But it's with a particular left twinge.
There can be none of the distinctiveness of an Alexander the Great or an Alcibiades. Plutarch is not going to write 47 lives of Spartacus.
Yeah. But he does have a very admiring portrayal of him in the life of Crassus.
But
that's Plutarch and not.
Well, exactly.
Trumbo.
This is not these sort of
communist
of Christianity.
Sorry.
What we're really getting at here, I think, is perhaps why some of the most brilliant critics on the left who were of the managerial society, where perhaps they got caught up and became Keir Starmer or the generation that produced that. It's the equality question.
This is where my thoughts are heading to. Yeah.
Right at the end of the day, who is able to provide a criticism of equality, of mass society, and of the society of mass consumption? The difficult thing, I think, in our own intellectual conservatism in the world of the intellectual right is that we're now at a point whereby difference perhaps between the Reagan era and the Trump era, right? Is the ideal of the Reagan era was to promulgate the society of mass consumption, to ensure that was something that was spread to Eastern Europe, spread to corners of the world where the nature of the economy made that impossible. And yet we've seen some of the limitations of that, seen some of the temptations that that way of thinking pulls us toward. But the ultimate issue here is whether we have the capacity and the resources to not just to switch, as we do in the present era, to talk less about the importance of consumption, but more in terms of the importance of production, of producers. Really, what the tech side is very good at.
Creators.
But maybe I would actually resist a little bit of that characterization of the Reagan era and the Reagan era right, because in fact, Solidarity, which is a labor movement, and the Polish Pope, these things, much more so than simply introducing American consumer products to Eastern Europe, this idea of a return to faith, to the nation state, even to the labor union as opposed to the Communist Party, these were the great themes of sort of the last phase of the Cold War, including with Ronald Reagan. Now, certainly, both Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, perhaps to an even greater degree, you do have privatization, commercialization, and so forth. But even then, you can see that at the end of the Cold War, when we had, decades of Keynesianism to get out from underneath, that some of that may have been justified in the circumstances, whereas today, and really starting in the 1990s with Clinton and with Tony Blair, we very quickly understand that consumerism and commercialism can be left-wing and liberal managerialist as opposed to being aligned with faith or with nation states.
The 80s are not the 50s, though. And I think we have to remember the Cold War began as a struggle for Christian civilization, and it ended as a struggle for liberal democracy.
No, I wouldn't agree with that. I think that's the Francis Fukuyama line.
It's Augusto de Noce's line.
I don't think fair enough, but I don't think that's actually how the Eastern Europeans who wanted to have their own countries back and escape from Soviet domination, and oftentimes wanted to have more freedom to go to church and didn't want to be followed by communist officials and secret services. I don't want to paint an excessively romantic picture of the rejection of communism by Eastern Europe. But it was not simply a move towards a commercial future, and there was this sense.
You have the example of when Pope John Paul II went to Poland in the middle. They started breaking out singing.
No, I agree. I think you're quite right to emphasize that. My own point is that the spiritual condition of the West and the East got worse from 1950 to 1980, not better. And then B, this was part of one of the themes that exploded afterwards, the mass consumption issue. And what we're trying to, I think, what we need to think about now, and go back to the equality question, is let's use a concrete example about the humanities. Many of us love the humanities curriculum. We were formed by it, shaped by it. We think this is important, that this should be taught. Is that a curriculum, a 4-year degree in liberal arts? Is that something that we think should be something taught to everyone in the country? And I just mean in principle available. Is that something that everyone should go through? Is everyone capable? Is everyone capable of going through it?
Well, of course not, right?
Exactly,
I mean, that's I think an obvious. Now, everyone, I think, just like with Christianity, everyone is capable of becoming a saint, right? So everyone has the potential to be heroically virtuous enough that they become a saint. But not everyone has the potential to become a Constantine or a Thomas Aquinas. Like, there's different ways that can play out. Alex, I'm wondering if we can, as we're kind of thinking practically on two levels, specifically with education. You were a professor, Princeton trained classicist, you dropped out of the academy, you're doing something new, but it's actually something very old in your approach to education. So I'm wondering if you could speak institutionally what you think needs to happen, both with elites, right, or future leaders, and with kind of the mass of the population, the everyday citizen in a republic. And then lastly, very practically, if you're just an 18-year-old and you're listening in on this conversation and you do, to Bill's point, feel stuck, what can you do, practically speaking, so that some of this greatness can rub off on you in your day-to-day?
Well, I'm sure we all have a lot of opinions on this, but I think that the whole idea that the liberal arts is a kind of that sitting in our minds, occupying that space is like a 4-year degree in English or classics. I mean, it's probably not classics in most people's minds these days, but whatever it is, history, that's a big problem, because it's not supposed to be, in the classical mindset, at least, the training in rhetoric, which is the basis of their education, the training in speaking and emulation that I mentioned earlier, that's not supposed to be in any way in tension with your training in warfare. It's also an exclusive education. I'm not saying that it can't be democratized on some level, but the liberal arts, which is a Latin idea, that the Greek idea is something else. It's about the muses or paideia, but at least we'll stick with liberal arts. It's about the free men as opposed to the slaves, and the most free in particular, the ruling class. It's really an education for leadership, which is by definition a narrow sliver of society, depending. At the very least, it's for a kind of small set of the citizens, and so it has to work for those people first and foremost. And if it works for everybody else, it's only because it's kind of aspiring to meet that model of what a training in leadership should be.
And is that a great books education, or is that something else?
Well, I've criticized the idea of great books because I think that the great books model is very modern. It's a 20th century invention that is designed to kind of put a finger in the dam that progressive education, John Dewey and Charles Eliot in the late 19th century just gutted the whole idea of the great man theory of education, which is essentially this rhetorical training in becoming a speaker like the great speakers, and a statesman like the great statesmen of the past. And they said, and this trend was motivated by their desire to have a talented managerial bureaucracy, that governed through science and not through these old-fashioned ideas like virtue and emulation.
And for all the criticism, the great books tradition is one that we sort of look at across the Atlantic from afar. It's not really one that's developed particularly in Britain or I think in Europe. And I think one of the things that befuddles us a little is certainly me with this sort of idea of a canon of great books, is that it's, for all the criticisms leveled at it by the left and modern educationists in the post-Dewey era, it's curiously agnostic on questions of value and character and morality and worth and what is admirable.
How is it curiously agnostic?
Well, so any canon that includes a Hobbes and a Machiavelli, as well as sort of Locke and a Hume and a Kant,
Freud,
they're all great.
Yeah.
But are they true? Are they conducive to beauty? Are they conducive to the cultivation of goodness? I don't understand. It seems to me suspicious that this phrase of great. It's a strange application of the notion of greatness.
One of I think Modern Age published it. Frederick Williamson's essay, "Great Books, Enemies of Wisdom," I think gets at this problem
I must
very,
read that.
very well.
Yes,
that elaborates
really
my suspicion, I suspect.
Very, very powerful account of this, and I think it goes back to the provocation I'm trying to put out amongst us for discussion, that the great books model, the sense that everyone needs to learn this canon to be a good citizen, master this canon to be a good citizen. There's a lot of value in that, but this is a presupposition that flows out of mass democracy, maybe a reaction to some of the excesses, maybe a reaction to the vocational or technical model of education. But it does seem to me like it's part and parcel of that model, which is ultimately
we need virtuous citizens at scale.
Agnostic, not just about spirituality, not just about religion, so that we can make this as inclusive as
we
possible.
need Hobbesians and Machiavellians and Lockeans and Kantians.
That evacuates what leadership or statesmanship.
And it's only the right side of the post-war consensus, which is a liberal consensus fundamentally, that the free marketplace of ideas and surely the stronger versions of
No. Come on, look. So it's fine to criticize the great books as a particular fad that takes off in the post-war era. But the element of truth that perhaps the great books project has hijacked is you certainly did have various canons that were extremely important in Renaissance education for centuries, in fact. And that canon it was a complex canon. It included the great works of classical philosophy. It included Christian theology. It also included modern philosophers like Machiavelli. And this was precisely the training, the educational, philosophical development that all the great statesmen, until the last 100 years, basically, were subjected to. So one question is, I disagree actually with this claim that the ruling class is the freest. That certainly is not the view one would take of tyrants and the view one would take of any number of ruling class figures who in fact are slaves. And we have a servile ruling class right now in the West, and we need to get away from that. And if the liberal arts tradition, I should say, not the watered down great books, vulgarized version, but the actual traditional classical and Christian liberal arts, and even modern, if those are indeed fit for the free man, and the free man is at least, I think, the stepping stone to the great man and the citizen, then we have to take that canon back, and we have to make sure that it's not just that it's not filtered through this best practices, conventional liberal managerial constraint, which is what unfortunately the great books have become, but rather that the natural elite, people who have the capacity to feel the humanity of these works, including the works that may have a very dark side, whether it's Rousseau or Hobbes or anyone else, but the people who are capable of understanding what these works say and why they are important, they have to be reached. And I do feel there's a risk here of I think even we on the right are too bound by some of our conventions and pre-existing categories, when in fact what we have right now is an age of disintegration, an age of entropy, where a lot of these rules and practices that have constrained people are disintegrating now, which means there has to be a lot more entrepreneurialism, intellectually speaking. And people have to go and tackle the canon, the great literature of the liberal arts. Again, not the vulgarized great books, but the real substance of Western letters. They have to do this on their own, and they have to do it now, maybe with a small group of friends, yes, but it's largely going to be something that you have to, as a intellectual entrepreneur in your own right, as a person trying to reclaim your humanity against a machine, are going to have to make the effort individually to do. And you should not be discouraged. You should actually, be courageous and even maybe a little reckless in tackling that canon.
And this is why it's important what Alex is doing, I think, because
and you yourself too, Nathan.
Yeah, with the summer programs that I've started and been involved
What's interesting about both of the excellent initiatives that you've been engaged in is that they are extra-institutional, or they exist right at the very fringes of the very institutions whose founding ideals promoted the kind of vision that Dan was setting out. And I would say actually in Oxford and Cambridge things are a little bit better, still a little bit freer, but the problems are still there. But maybe that's not a bad place. Look what happened from catacombs to Constantine is a relatively short, 12 years?
Now, I will make a criticism of Oxbridge, though. So there was a kind of blip of discussion on social media about a year ago where a number of Oxford graduates were proudly posting their extensive reading lists and saying, look, I read 100 of these great works of Western literature over the course of 3 months. And I thought to myself, that is a great way of showing your ignorance and shallowness.
It's the English literature lot.
If you were to say, oh, I had a class with Aristotle, but I only audited one course that he gave and only sat in on a couple of classes, you'd be advertising yourself as a complete fool. Similarly, if you say, oh, I read the Politics in an afternoon, well, you didn't really read the Politics then. So one piece of advice I would give to listeners and viewers is read slowly and read deeply rather than reading quickly.
Let me just add, I must come to the defense of Oxbridge here.
He's contractually obligated.
The problem, I don't remember those Twitter exchanges, but it is true. That is true of the English degrees at Oxbridge. There's a lot of controversy when English emerged as a candidate for a degree in the mid-19th century at Oxford and Cambridge. There was a sense that this is not serious study, not serious inquiry. This is something you can really do in the bath on a Saturday morning for the rest of your life. You can't do that with Thucydides. You can't do that with Homer. And one of the reasons I'm feel so fortunate to have done classics as an undergraduate is that, in particular at Oxford, it was incredibly rigorous, and there was an awful lot of Greek and Latin that you had to get through. and you had to do it slowly, to your point, Dan. There were no shortcuts. You were going to be tested on the unseens and the comments, and it took me 3 months to read the Iliad. And a very painful experience, but one of the ones I'm most proud of doing. And you have to linger over the language, and you have to just saturate yourself in it. And same with Plutarch too. And it's very, very difficult. And sadly, these are traditions that are fading, even in Oxbridge.
Well, I think it's about developing your taste for greatness too, and that has to happen through depth. You have to really spend time with a person to get the full measure of them. Like you have to spend time with these books, and that's much more important than well, we could say ticking the boxes, or just working your way through the canon,
skimming Aristotle's Politics. So
yeah, exactly. Like these are supposed to be with you for the rest of your life. They're the great works of the Mirrors for Princes or Aristotle's Politics. I mean, this is something that you should be reading when you're 40, 50, 60 and on. And so the idea of getting it over with is completely contrary to what it's supposed to be, to bring out that greatness of soul in you.
And I would actually submit that to go to your observation about the conventional way, one of the dangers that we have is to think and focus entirely on the 18 to 22 age bracket and lose track of everyone else. And what's valuable about your initiative is you catch people at a later stage in life who may have been very big, as we all remember our own undergraduate days. It's very, very difficult to master everything that we wanted and let a lot of that go. But at a certain stage in life, we have some extra leisure time, and where do we go at that stage to find our tutors? Where do we go at that stage to find our guides? And it's very, very difficult because all the energy, all the op-eds are about, say, higher education reform rather than serving the young professionals who've gotten their degrees, gotten their program of studies, and now are looking for precisely this moral, intellectual formation. Their souls are ambitious souls. They're looking for guidance as they develop and proceed in the path of greatness. But who will provide it for them? It has to be us.
To tie things together, I want to come back to Nathan, your idea of the idea of providence that you mentioned earlier, because I think if you're looking at it through a human excellence perspective or a political perspective, I think, Cicero says imitation is the shortcut to greatness. I'm paraphrasing, but it's pretty evident to me, kind of looking at these great individuals from history, that it is through imitation of other great leaders. It's through an imagination steeped in Virgil's Aeneid or Homer that you really create someone, inculcate the virtues that lead to kind of greatness in the public square. But speaking kind of from my own Christian perspective, and particularly my Eastern Orthodox perspective, a theologian is not someone who, now, line between imitation and study, but a theologian isn't someone who just sits and writes and logically thinks about God. A theologian is someone who prays, right? And so I think to this list of imitation and imagination, you really should add participation. And particularly, there's this sense in which as human beings, we wake up in the morning and our minds, they latch on to the things of the earth, right? The worries, the concerns, the cares of the world. And so I do think it is important, kind of this centering ourselves, not just on kind of the worthy lives of the Cicero or the Winston Churchill, but also that there's that communion with God, right, through the sacramental life of the church, through prayer, because I do think that how do you, is it just our own initiative or is it the hand of providence? And I think coming from a conservative perspective, we want that individual ambition to actually be set humbly before the providence of Almighty God, to then guide us, right, to those roles when the moment arises.
And this is the importance of doing. So as you, lex credendi, lex orandi, I think people tend to think that if you want to influence the masses, you want to help people, change how they behave, you need to first change how they think. And what we learned from the terrible totalitarians of the 20th century and even today is that that's not true. If you can force people to change how they behave, they will change how they think on their own because the cognitive pain is too great. So if you can, through threat of force or violence, frighten people into behaving one way, the dictator can get you to believe what he wants
But
you
it
to
didn't
believe.
work. I mean, the Soviet project collapsed.
There are others.
But
This is Jacques Ellul's definition of propaganda. It's a very valuable
but here's my argument. So that's the dark side of that coin. The virtuous side of that coin is, okay, let's say you don't believe anything, but you want to. And you think that there's some great truth out there. And if you're listening right now and you don't know and you're kind of wandering twixt the winds, go to church, sit there and pray. You don't even need to believe, but you can being present with others, participating in the liturgy. That action will elevate your mind and open you up to have a willingness to begin to believe. And that takes a lot of courage, and that takes a lot of faith that maybe you don't have. But just go do it. Just, whether it's in the tech world, go start building, go to church, go do it, and it will come to you later. Yeah.
On that note, we'll wrap.
Okay.
Thank you for watching Project Cosmos, Conversations on the Future of Civilization, which is a production of ISI, the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. If you're a student, professor, or lifelong learner who wants to get more involved with ISI, visit isi.org or follow us on social media to learn more about our educational programs that teach the foundations of Western and American civilization and what it means to be a great and good man or woman today. That's isi.org, or like and follow us on social media. Thank you.